Um, so a bit of IOSH news quickly. There's some links at the top there. Um, I think it's key. The one good thing that's come out of COVID, well, there are probably others, but it's been able to get involved with other branches to actually um, sit in on their sessions. I've personally been accused of stalking Scotland branches. They've had some great presentations up there, and you know, you use it, and they're at all times of the day and evening as well. So there's opportunities, but you can always catch up on those through the IOSH website. IOSH itself with its bi-weekly webinars, and bear in mind there's one tomorrow on the important subject in relation to COVID and mental health, psychosocial risks, impacts and mitigation. So that promises to be an interesting conversation. The virtual AGM has been announced on the 27th, and remember, those who are eligible, your vote counts. So get involved in that. Don't forget IOSH magazine, contributions welcome. And I'm pleased to say two of our committees featured in there recently, both Kurt and Shireen. So look back at that one. Future Leaders Community Growing.
I've got a web now going, but I can listen to it on the earphones. How are you?
I can hear somebody talking. If you could mute your mic. Yeah, Future Leaders Community with monthly events. Again, look for the links on those. The membership grades review, that's moving on all the time. And we're waiting for approval, obviously, at the AGM, and then more information will be released. Desperate times. A lot of people I've spoken to, they're considering or they're moving on, moving jobs, or even sadly will be losing their jobs the way things are going. So I've used the old expression from that well-known TV play, Gives a Job, and yeah, use the IOSH jobs page as well. There's some interesting jobs around the world there. There's one particularly for the National Trust in Scotland. If I'd have been 20 years younger, I might have gone for that one myself. But there we are. There's one in Brunei for those for our international colleagues as well. But there are some really interesting jobs coming up on there. And then finally, if all else fails and we find ourselves in difficult times, there's IOSH Benevolent Fund. So it's there for you, for your benefit if you are in difficult times, but also IOSH would welcome donations for those who feel able to support it and their colleagues. And ultimately, don't forget to read Connect. I think that's key. That's where you can keep up to date. It's easy for it to get buried in the emails, I find. So, bringing us to today, a quick rush through. We're going to try and end soon after 7. People Power. Some of you might remember, those that are UK based anyway, a pretty dreadful sitcom called Citizen Smith back in, I don't know when that would have been, the 70s, I suppose. But yeah, power to the people, and that's a sort of image that has stuck with me for a long time. We had a session back in August with Hyacinth when she spoke about human capital and supporting individuals and organisations to help them achieve their potential. And again, that presentation is available online through our LinkedIn and on the website through YouTube. People Power was the heading in the last IOSH magazine, and some good articles covering that this evening in there, relevant to this evening too. But actually, tonight, we've got Dan Shears bouncing in. Now, I'm just going to look at my notes. I've known Dan for many years, back in our days in HSE together, back in the local office. And I think you can't tell there from the picture of Dan, but he's a larger than life character, that's for sure. His height actually isn't the only way you can give perhaps a different perspective this evening on the impact of COVID. He's really been at the front line as a director of the GMB Union's Health, Safety and Environment Department. And in that, he's been involved right from the start. I'm not going to steal any of his thunder, and I'll let him give a bit more detail on that. But I think this is a unique opportunity. I think it's a first for IOSH to have a presentation from somebody so involved in the TU movement as Dan, to give that very different perspective. And many of their workers are working in the front line and have been and are still exposed to this significant has it. So, without any more ado, I think, Louise, I did gloss over when I was talking about the branch, just sort of pending changes, really. Would you like to say something before we get into that?
Yeah, just thanks, Alan. Hi, everybody, and thanks for coming online tonight. This is our first evening session, and we're kind of mixing it up to see if we can get as many people as we can to sort of come online. And it's really great to see a full house, and I'm looking forward to today's session. I think, as many of our regular Chiltern members know, I was delighted to be nominated as President-elect, subject to the AGM, of course, which is on the 27th of October, which Alan has mentioned. And all going well after that date, I will be President-elect, which means that I'll be President from next year. And Chiltern, I've been involved with the Chiltern branch. Well, I've always been a member of the Chiltern branch, but I've been in a leadership role for probably getting on for 6 years now. So, you know, with my changing roles in IOSH, you know, we've built up a really strong committee. It's a really fun place to be if anybody is interested in joining. But I'm delighted to be handing over the reins to a new interim chair and a new interim vice chair. And I thought we've kind of made those decisions internally within the committee, and I'm going to carry on working alongside them. But I just wanted to hand over to Melissa and introduce her as the new chair. And Melissa, if you just want to say a few words.
Yes, hi there. Hello, everyone. So nice to meet you all. Just really looking forward to this opportunity, very exciting. And I've been a member of the Chiltern branch this year, and it has been such a rewarding experience working with Louise and the team. And so very honored to get this opportunity to take the team forward over the next few months. Looking forward to us continuing our engagements via the webinars, the different events that we're thinking of doing. We're looking forward to getting feedback from yourselves to make the branch continue to be exciting and engaging and rewarding. So really great times, and just really want to say thanks to Louise. She's been a great personal mentor to myself, and you know, I haven't been with the Chiltern branch for the 6 years, but from the feedback from everyone, you've done such a great job, and some really huge shoes to fill. And but I think with myself, Luke, and the rest of the committee, we'll continue to take the banter and take it
and
forward
hit it out of the park.
Make the Chiltern branch great one.
Yeah.
So good, thanks.
So yeah, no, so thank you for that, Melissa. And yeah, so you know, it's going to get bigger and better, because I think Melissa and Luke and the rest of the team are going to bring even fresher, newer ideas. So I'm really excited to see what the team does. But yeah, Alan, I'm going to hand back to yourself and Dan.
Thank you very much.
And look forward to the presentation.
Yeah, I've just opened up the full screen in gallery mode to see how many mugshots I can see. There's a lot of blank spaces, so it's really nice to be able to see your faces. And this is an interactive session. You know, we want plenty of questions. We'll keep an eye, as I said, of putting the questions through the chat box. If there's something that we need to pick up or can pick up on the way through, but we're pushed for time, so we'll see where we get to, and if there are any questions left unanswered, we'll put those together as a transcript, as well as posting the Dan's presentation. And it's being recorded, so yep, you pushed the button, Louise, well done. So anything I've said now I can't take back. You're there to keep me in order as much as anything. Anyway, Dan, great to sort of see you again anyway. And as I said, you know, we've enjoyed working together over the years, and I'm really pleased to see where you've found yourself now, and in more ways than one actually. And and I think doing a great job. And we've seen them in various interviews and so on, and championing the cause. So well done, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Alan. And thank you for the invite, everybody, this evening. I hope you're all keeping as well as you can be under the circumstances. I am, as Alan said, Dan Shears. I've been the Head of Health and Safety at the GMB now for just coming up for 5 years. I've been with the union for 12 years altogether. So effectively was the Assistant Director before that. And before that, when I was a very young man, worked with Alan, Tony Cox and others for the HSC, both in the Luton Field office and then into the National Central Office in London. So yes, I've been really quite heavily involved with health and safety my entire working life. And certainly that's been very useful for the last few months, because I suppose for my sins, I've been at the nexus of what you might call the interface between the trade unions, industry and government in terms of how COVID has been handled. Not just in terms of the UK government at Westminster, but also the devolved administrations and occasionally beyond that into Europe. So it's been a time quite unlike any other. And what I'm going to hopefully try and give you over the next 40 minutes or so is just a bit of an insight into some of the things that we've had to deal with, some of the issues that we've come up with, some of that, what I think were the key periods around this. And I think really where things are heading next. And I have to say today's figures, having seen them this afternoon, has been absolutely shocking. Not surprising, unfortunately, given the direction of travel. But I do think that the darkest days are really here coming over the next week or two. Having said that, we're in a much better position, I think, now societally than we were in March. And as a result, with the measures that are already in place, that hopefully will mitigate some of the deaths, some of the very serious ill health we saw back in the spring. But it will rely on everybody playing their parts. And hopefully some of what I'm going to say over the next few minutes will give some food for thought in some cases. And again, if anyone has got any questions, do feel free to raise them. I'm happy to either pick them up at the time or perhaps better take them at the end. What I would say is I'll give the usual health warnings with this. As you probably guessed, I'm at home. I am sitting about as close as I can get to our Wi-Fi connection, so I'm hoping the signal will be stable. But you may have already seen my wife, daughter and puppy. There is always the active risk at any point they may jump in, so apologies for any background noise or any disruption. The other point I would make is I've been doing calls like this pretty much all day since about 8:30 this morning. So if I do get dry at any point and have to stop for a quick drink, I do apologise for that as well. But yes, one of the great things about the evening seminars is that you get a much greater chance to talk to people and bring more people in. But it often gets a bit dry after you've been doing this for quite some time. But with that caveat aside, let me please kick on. And I'll start at the beginning. So the GMB is a general union. We will represent any member in any workplace. And as a result, we operate across the whole of the UK economy. We're across all 4 of the devolved nations and the Republic of Ireland, although our membership there is smaller. And unusually for most trade unions, we are split exactly 50-50 between the public and private sectors. So the bulk of our membership is in the public sector. About half of all GMB members are in public sector employment. The remainders are primarily in construction, engineering, retail, security, literally every part of every sector of the economy. And within that, our membership is split almost exactly 50-50 as well. So traditionally, the union, which was formed over 125 years ago, was a blue-collar industry formed at Beckton Gas Works. We were the original gas and asbestos workers union. But over time, we've developed outwards, and now we have as many female as male members. And that became quite an interesting challenge with some of the gender issues around COVID. We also organise in most of the UK's largest companies, not necessarily the sole trade union, but in many of those on the screen, particularly as the National Grid, G4S, British Gas, British Airways, we have substantial membership. So as a result, there are 2 things that really flow from that size of membership. We're the 3rd largest union in the UK, but also that range of different sectoral interests means that health and safety, perhaps more than many other unions, is a really key issue for us. The GMB's always had a large health and safety sort of following department. There are 2 of us that work in the national office, myself and my colleague Lindsay Mann, and we have 9 regional colleagues that all handle health and safety within their regions to some degree. Some are more competent than others. Some are IOSH Tech SP. Some really have it as more of a watching brief. But we all have that interaction and that link regionally. And that's been very important for us because it means we can get intelligence very quickly and we can get messages out into the field, into our organisers, into workplaces. So when we pick up something that needs to be addressed, or hopefully more recently with good practice, we can take that quickly and share it through our networks and make sure that where we do find something that needs to be done quickly, we can get that implemented. So that's been a real benefit of this period. We've got 30,000 safety representatives. That figure is growing daily as more and more workers are finding their voice in workplace and finding a role for themselves. The other side of it, from a policy point of view, is that we are representative on pretty much every major HSE committee. As much as anything as a historical thing, because we organise in so many sectors, we've got seats on pretty much every HSE council, every committee. So we are on Cognac, we're on Padiac, we're on Simple, the Plastics Forum, the Food Manufacturing Forum, Waste Industry Safety Group, Public Sector Forum. And many of you will know that Sir Paul Kenny, who was our General Secretary until 2016, was on the HSE board over a period of almost 10 years. And it was my, I suppose, duty and responsibility to brief Sir Paul on HSE board matters. So from an internal point of view, from an external point of view, from a policy point of view, we probably are one of the better placed unions in terms of the handling of COVID response because of the history we've had in looking at health and safety issues. But having said that, it's been a challenging period with all of this. And we had early warning actually of what potentially was coming. So part of my role is dealing with our counterparts in Europe. We spent a lot of time talking to European trade unions, not just in terms of Brexit, but more generally in terms of industrial issues. And one of my colleagues, Manola, in Italy, had flagged up that they'd started to see a real spike in cases of what at that point was considered to be a flu that seemed to be linked to Chinese New Year and was having some impact in industrial terms. And she was really looking for advice from a number of European colleagues about how that would be handled. We initially were caught quite unawares at this point. There wasn't much understanding of what was going on in Wuhan, let alone in the rest of Europe. But it was pretty clear that they had a problem in Italy. It was pretty clear that this was growing quite quickly. So we had a discussion initially with colleagues elsewhere. The feeling at that point was that this may be worse than SARS or Middle East respiratory syndrome, but no one really knew. So our first initial guidance in January was just really some basic advice, talking about the principles around managing health and safety in this kind of area. Really nothing more than, this is what a risk assessment entails. The employer should be looking at what the cost regulations require. And if there is a potential risk here, you need to be thinking about either some kind of way of getting away from that risk, potentially taking people out of the workplace. For most of our members at that point, that really wasn't an issue because there wasn't simply an understanding of the risk involved. So our membership exposure at this point was primarily aviation and ambulance service, but also with a growing degree, the care sector and the security sector. So we knew early doors that there was a potential issue here, but we didn't know how big it would be. February was very much a watching brief, keeping an eye on developments, getting intelligence in from colleagues from the EU, from elsewhere, particularly Italy, then France, and then looking really at what the potential might be in the UK. And there was this general growing sense at this point that actually things were getting worse and getting worse quite quickly. But no one quite knew where this was going. At this point, it was not very clear exactly where we stood, exactly what was expected, exactly, to be frank, what we could demand in terms of the health and safety response. Things were being very much couched in terms of public health. This was very much a public health issue, no different to the flu, very much a seasonal thing. And as a result, it was not very clear whether we actually even had a role to play. But as I'm sure it did for many of you, everything changed and changed quite rapidly in March. So our initial policy position, when it became clear that we were starting to see people potentially having to self-isolate, potentially developing symptoms, was just to be clear on these 5 points. So the most important point was this one about information, actually getting very clear and concise information. Because one of the things that has been staggering during this whole pandemic is the degree to which social media has filled vacuums. So if people are unclear about what the position is, if they're unclear about what the health issue is, they'll look on Facebook, they'll look on Twitter, they'll look on LinkedIn, and they will very much take for granted what they find from there. We found that people were willing to believe what, to my mind, seemed quite outlandish information. And it hit ahead really quite early doors when a colleague of ours in Scotland got an urgent phone call from someone that wanted to know whether they should be pouring bleach all over the place and trying to sanitize their hands with effectively what was domestic antibacterial cleaner, because in the bottle it would kill coronavirus. Now, that was from a safety rep who, to be frank, probably should have known better, but they read this on Facebook and said, yes, if you spray your hands with these products, it will make sure this virus is killed. Now, clearly that's not the case, was never the intention, but that kind of thing was getting great credit back then because there wasn't at that point any information against it. So we were very clear from the front that there needed to be information, both from government and from employers, about what the potential issues were, as best as they could do. From there, and really this second point hasn't changed during this entire period, it was about explaining very quickly that we needed to make sure there wasn't a perverse incentive for any worker to come into work with symptoms. And that was about ensuring as best we could that there was no loss of pay, no loss of holiday entitlement, no disciplinary action from having to self-isolate or having to take periods of time away from work. Obviously, for many of our members, they couldn't do work from home because many of them were key workers. and that became a particular issue when the lockdown occurred. But even at this stage, we were seeing employers saying, well, no, if you have to self-isolate, if you've got this condition, you're going to have to go home, and that goes into your sick record. That will be a statutory sick pay situation. We're still seeing this to a point. And it does cause problems because there is an economic loss involved with that. For members in the public sector in particular, if this is considered to be sick pay for those working in schools, those in the care sector, they may have to self-isolate repeatedly, and that becomes more of an issue with the new track and trace app. So there are real concerns here that people will come into work if they have symptoms because they simply can't afford to take a loss. So we've been very clear from day one that that had to be addressed because there was a real fear that people would come into work and they would start seeing outbreaks because symptomatic workers didn't have any alternative than to come in. We were very clear from the start that actually PPE was not going to be the way to solve this because it was obvious that there won't be enough. We predicted very early the kind of problems we'd see in the care sector, just from the feedback we're getting from members. There wasn't a great understanding of what was required at the time, understandably so because it was new for everybody. But we were very upfront with government that there needs to be a situation addressed in terms of supply, whether it was from overseas, whether it was from European counterparts, or whether it was UK manufacturing itself. One of the many hats that I wear is I'm involved with the British Safety Industry Federation. So I had a reasonably clear understanding of where the PPE suppliers were in Europe, where they were in the UK, and how that supply mechanism worked. And clearly, if many of the products are being manufactured in China, and China effectively is quarantining itself, you have an obvious supply problem. So we could see several steps down that there was going to be issues coming down the track in terms of getting supply. China seemed to be out of bounds, and the rest of Europe probably looking after their own interests before sharing more widely. So we tried to push quite hard with government on that. But again, at this period, there wasn't much of an understanding at this stage that this was the issue it would become. So we knew that supply was a problem here. We also, along the same lines, were calling for an establishment of a very clear and quick testing progress, because members were saying to us, look, I've got symptoms, I think I may have a cold, it may be a flu, but it may be this new thing. How do I know? I don't want to come into work if I'm going to cause a problem, if I'm going to make people ill. But at the same time, it's springtime, there are other issues happening, there are other health conditions being affected. What I don't want to do is come into work and then get told to come home, but I don't want to come into work if it's not this new flu. So we were very keen to ensure that there was a testing program in place. But we wanted to make sure that didn't come at the expense of overloading the NHS. We didn't want to be sending people for tests unnecessarily, but the provision needed to be there. And probably the biggest thing for us, and this became more of an issue once the lockdown occurred, was this point about serious and imminent danger. There were some very early things going on social media about asserting protections, about asserting rights to effectively walk away from the job on the basis it was an unsafe working condition and that it may affect the worker themselves or others. We were clear at this stage that for most people, from just the intelligence we'd had from China and elsewhere, the majority of people that were getting this flu were recovering from it, but for some people it was incredibly high risk and they needed urgent protection. So that was really our sort of top 5 points, if you like, from late February, early March, that we were then trying to push out to employers and trying to push out to governments more widely, with, I have to say, a varying degree of success. Some of these are still issues today, and we're probably unlikely at this stage to win some of these arguments. But where things really begin to speed up, I guess, was the first week of March. On the 5th of March, we had the first meeting of the sort of new year of the TUC's Health and Safety Specialists, which is my counterparts across most of the TUC unions. That was an interesting meeting because Hugh Robertson, who'd been the lead officer for the TUC for many years, had retired in the middle of 2019, and his new appointed replacement, Shelley Asquith, was chairing this meeting for the first time, her first meeting. So a lot of introductory work, Shelley brand new into the job, very uncertain about what the issues were, very uncertain about how this coronavirus was going to impact. And we discussed the matter in passing, but at this stage, there was no real agreement. There was no kind of specific approach that came out of that meeting. I was very clear that I thought we had a real problem here, that I thought there were genuine concerns about this becoming much more serious quite quickly. The respect of most colleagues was, well, possibly so, but it may be, nothing more than Mars, SIRS. We've been here before. There's nothing at this stage to panic about. I made a point about asking around Workers' Memorial Day at the end of April, what the contingency plan was for that if that had to be cancelled, and was effectively told that we don't worry about it, this will be over and finished by that point. And with hindsight, if only it had been. So that was quite a chastening experience for me and quite a disappointing meeting. I think the opportunity there was missed. I probably should have been a bit more progressive, perhaps a bit harder in terms of trying to reach a specific agreement there. But off the back of that, we then looked at developing our own first set of serious guidelines around this. And that formed some background, more detailed background on COVID itself, what the symptoms were, what the issues were in terms of health, who might be affected by it, then making sure that our members had got detailed checklists around risk assessment, cost assessments, what they need to do, reiterating their rights for consultation, particularly the safety reps regs, safety committee regs, and then putting these into checklists. We then obviously had that same week the COVID budget, Rishi Sunak putting a package of measures together. We looked internally in some detail about how that might impact the world of work. And from that, we started looking in detail about some of the wider issues that would impact on people's ability to come into work or not. And that was this point around, can we put money aside for PPE, particularly for social care in the NHS? Would statutory sick pay be a driver to get people out of or into work? And the idea of furlough, and it certainly didn't start from me, but the idea of furlough from some of my colleagues in our research teams, our economic department, began to be kicked around as a serious matter for consideration. And we were able to get into the government, the Treasury, the Department for Business very quickly in terms of looking at the scheme. If people had to come out of the workplace for any kind of period, to ensure there wasn't huge economic loss and to be sure we didn't have this, again, perverse incentive to keep attending. So all of this is snowballing quite quickly. And you could see the numbers were going up, things were changing. There was suddenly a sense of urgency around this that even on the 5th of March just simply wasn't there. Just over that weekend, it was apparent things were moving. What changed everything really was the following week. At this point, my own personal view was, okay, this isn't looking great, but it may not be too serious. And then two really serious things happened in the space of 24 hours. The first was I was invited with a couple of colleagues of mine to a meeting at the Cabinet Office from the Civil Contingencies Unit. All of the trade unions that have membership in the civil service were asked to attend this meeting. We met with the head of the Civil Contingencies Unit. They were very clear cut, very stark. They had the projections from SAGE. And at that point, the estimation, and it's now in the public domain, at this point we were embargoed, but you can say it's freely now, was that the prediction was 500,000 deaths unless action was taken. Now, we were reassured at this point action would be taken, that SAGE was looking at a whole range of measures, and as a result, this was literally the worst case scenario. But the rhetoric from that point had been, this is going to be fairly straightforward, containable. We don't think we're in a serious position here. This, to my mind, changed everything. But of course, we weren't in a position really to start going public about these figures, because at the moment, this was all very much secret and contained. That was until the following night, and the photo on the screen was really what changed my thinking around all of this. Because the chap on the left in the jacket is Professor John Edmonds, a very leading epidemiologist. The guy in the middle with his hands on his head is Thomas Puyo, who was, and I believe still is, some kind of technologist from San Francisco, California. The argument between these two chaps was very simple. The guy on the television screen was saying, you need to implement testing, tracing, and a lockdown now. John Edmonds, who was on stage, who's a very leading epidemiologist, was saying, no, we don't need to do that because we think we can successfully pursue a policy of herd immunity. And that means the natural immunity effectively of the population will ensure that we get this benefit over time. And as a result, we don't think we'll have a problem. What scared the living daylights out of me was that it completely contradicted everything I'd heard the day before at the Cabinet Office. And at that point, I thought, if the leading scientists are saying something different from the civil service, there's a real problem here. And we need to address this very quickly. So that almost changed the gears in my head and prompted a whole range of actions for us. Effectively, the following Monday, we put an order out to all of our organisers to stop doing workplace visits. And by the end of that week, we'd locked down as an organisation before the government said to do so. Because it was clear that the rate that the numbers are going up, the rate of infections, something had to be done quite quickly. Our organisers and myself, we obviously visit multiple workplaces in a day. Some of us do it on a regional basis, many of us have to do it on a national basis. And as a result, the risk of any one of us becoming a super spreader was fairly high. I live, obviously got a young daughter, but my mother-in-law was just, she's in the clinically extremely vulnerable group, so I had a personal stake in all of this as well. But it was clear at this point that things had changed significantly and that the response to policy approach was not as clear-cut as we would have liked. The other thing this week that happened was the Irish government cancelled the celebration of St Patrick's Day at the same time that the UK government in Westminster was letting football matches go ahead and obviously allowing the Cheltenham Festival to happen. So at this point, the messaging was quite high, and that, to my mind, didn't really change during this period. But we were quite proactive, and at this point, it became quite clear-cut to us that we'd be at home for some time, and we'd have to look at actually getting our members in the workplace to be taking the bulk of our activity on our behalf. Often we go into workplaces, we help to meet employers, we negotiate with them, you know, we often have disagreements with them, but normally there's an officer there to help coordinate that and to make sure that our interests are aligned with our members' interests. You can't do that so well through this technology, but it became obvious we'd have to move quite quickly to try and set things up. 6 months ago, I had no idea what Zoom was. I'd barely used a Teams meeting before. I'm not a great user of social media. All of that had to change and change almost overnight because of the restrictions we were now putting upon ourselves. So that week was absolutely critical in the way that things developed. And if there's ever an image in my mind, it was Friday night sitting in front of the TV to my side here with a glass of white wine, watching this on Channel 4 News, watching Matt Fry interview these two chaps and not hearing a word of it, not believing what I was hearing, just almost being gobsmacked by the discussion. That I think will live with me for a very long time. So, as I said, we knew from late March that things were changing. We knew we'd have to make a very different approach to this. We couldn't continue sending people to workplaces. As a result, we moved pretty much all of our information online. We developed our online coronavirus hub. We crucially made that free. Most of our information has to be accessed through an online portal that you log into as a GMB member. The decision we took was to effectively suspend that because we needed people to get to it. And again, we know that not all of our members are the most conversant with technology. They're not all web users. Many of them don't have smartphones. They often work in roles that mean they can't use those things during the working day. So we had to make sure that this was information that was accessible to people. And we had to back it up in terms of getting the message out there. We know, again, that a lot of our members, they don't particularly like or enjoy having lots of written material. They want people to talk to them. They want people to explain things to them. So we did end up with an awful lot of briefings, webinars, online meetings and events. And the rate of change on that, the amount of things we did very quickly was quite phenomenal. I've probably done myself over 100 seminars, meetings during this period online, and I'd never done one before this year. So the rate of speed in terms of learning, not just what the key messages were, but understanding actually what this meant in terms of what members could go back into their workplaces and do, how one sector is impacted by another. We have to be very careful as a general union that we don't give different advice and contradictory advice from one sector to another, because clearly we want to have credibility and we don't want to be seen as telling, you know, effectively different tales to different employers in different sectors. So that consistency of approach is very important. And it meant for myself and my colleague Lindsay that almost we, from a sports point of view, became quarterbacks for the rest of the union. Effectively, we look at the sectoral issues, we look at the messages, we were making sure that whatever we were saying, we were consistent across as much as we could all sectors in our approach. The other thing that meant very clearly was that we had to ensure that our members in the workplace had the ability and the availability to actually take forward what we needed. Now, many of my sister unions, apart from perhaps retail and one or two others, effectively had to lock down, and their members also locked down. But the vast majority of our members in utilities and the public services and retail, many of those in security, in fact, every really area apart from aviation, were designated as key workers. So they were still in work to a degree. And that, again, put some challenges in, because it meant very quickly we had to build capacity. We had to be able to understand, right, how do you consult around risk assessment for this? Because no one really knows what COVID is at this point. How do we get inspection regimes in place? What structures have we got for consultation? If we don't have them, can we build them? Can we build them quickly? How can we get situations in place where we can do inspections, floor walks, and have regular dialogue with people around the issues? Particularly if we're not there and available with them. We can't just send somebody out to the factory. We can't send someone out to the building site now. So do we do that through periodic meetings? Is it a question of setting things up? And quickly we get to move to a structure of events exactly like this. Early mornings, late evenings when people aren't at work, really talking through in many respects very basic issues around construction, around consultation, around the kind of things, PPE provision, that at this point weren't clear to the members at all. And that was all done very quickly with huge speed and actually a huge amount of skill by colleagues who were much more aware of this technology than I was. But if we hadn't have just moved to using Zoom and Teams, we would have been absolutely stuck. So in many respects, we were lucky in terms of timing. But it was also remarkable from the other side how many of our members engaged with this quite quickly. A lot of our members are probably 45 and upwards. They're not always able to use this technology during the working day. Often they're using smartphones rather than tablets or PCs. And again, they adapted very quickly and then could then take the messaging back into their colleagues. And one of the best things I think we did, and again, I know this session is being videoed tonight, was having recordings available through YouTube or other means that people could watch in their own time. That made a big difference as well. So we were able to get a march on this. We were able to sort of steal ahead quite quickly. Some of our other sister unions were very much hamstrung by technology, but also by a lack of understanding of kind of what the stakes were here. Whereas we were able to use both that technology and the fact we were at home and had capacity to really get our messaging out and get it embedded quite quickly. And as a result, we did see genuine action remarkably quickly in many cases. I won't name the specific companies. I don't think that's right because I'm not entirely clear on who's on the call tonight. But anyone that knows the GMB will know that we have a long-standing recognition of one of the largest retailers in the country. And they were superb, even though their owner at the time wasn't particularly known to be a trade union-friendly business. They sat down with us more or less immediately. We talked through in great detail what we thought the issues were, and they went really above and beyond even what the government expected at this point. So they suspended all of their vulnerable workers, not the clinically vulnerable shielding workers, but anyone that they considered to be at higher risk. And they suspended them on full pay for the entire period of lockdown, which was really far beyond what we expected. But they understood very early doors again that if they were keeping their business open as a retailer, they didn't want to put anybody in particular harm's way, and they felt the risk because of the public interaction was very high. So we came to a good announcement there quite quickly, and that gave reassurance to a lot of our members that work for the same company in the distribution channel that actually they were being looked after as well, because the same approach was taken there. It wasn't just the supermarkets, it was the people behind the scenes as well. They're one of the biggest national care providers, who we had some industrial issues with, and obviously care is not a sector that is particularly well paid, agreed to furlough all of their pregnant workers, and then went beyond that to meet all of our demands on the provision of PPE. Before, again, we had the information from Public Health England. We had major concerns early doors about people that had COVID and COVID symptoms being taken out of a hospital environment to free up beds and put into a care environment. And again, because of our regional nature, we had intelligence very quickly that our members were starting to develop COVID symptoms and were clearly getting COVID from the care homes they were working in. Because at this point, there was no requirement for PPE, and there really wasn't a good understanding of what the risk was. So because we were at the national table with the employer, we were able to say to them very clearly, look, there are risks here. Some of this is well known, some of it's emergent, but we need to use the precautionary principle to ensure that you're not putting particularly the pregnant women at high risk. And again, they effectively reacted in exactly the way we'd expect, positively, took the step, although it was at some cost to them, to source the best PPE they could and to ensure that those pregnant women were furloughed at the moment that furlough scheme became available. So that was very important in terms of getting the reassurance there, but B, then using that example to go to other employers, not just in that sector, but other sectors, to say, look, again, we think you've got particularly pregnant workers here who may be at higher risk. You do need to give them severe consideration within this. This is not just about doing a risk assessment. It's about looking at their very particular work and how COVID may impact on them. The other thing that we could do off the back of that care experience, and bear in mind we also organised within paramedics and ambulance workers, was to take the evidence that we were getting in terms of their exposures back to Public Health and to say, look, you need to put extra provision in here. The original PHE line on this, and again, understandably so to a degree, was that the immediate and higher risk was to those workers, the doctors, the nurses, the staff in those wards that were dealing with admissions that were clearly COVID or COVID related. There wasn't much thought given down the chain to the ambulance staff, the paramedics that were effectively getting those people into the hospitals. And as a result, we were seeing quite alarming rates of people either having to self-isolate or coming down with COVID in those sectors. So we were able to get quick feedback into Public Health England, into the Department for Health, just to make it very clear what the experience was, what the issues were, what our recommended standards would be. And I'll be frank, there were some issues here around the provision of FFP3 masks, because we will clear up front that if there was no understanding of what exactly the rate of transmission was, what the mode of transmission was, our default was going to have to be FFP3. But of course, some of our employers, particularly the big local authorities, both have a care aspect and other aspects that are public facing. And so we were caught in a slight bind in terms of, did we prioritise care or do we prioritise those other workers, or in fact everybody, for FFP3? And the decision was taken, well, if you've only got limited resources, if you've only got limited masks, put them where we think the risk is highest. And at this point, that was very definitely the care sector. So we didn't quite win that argument with Public Health England in terms of care, but we did win the argument more generally that there was a need for PPE, there was a need for face masks. And that was changed, I think, end of March, early April. And that made a substantial difference. We had a large number of members that were ultimately infected and became ill with COVID, but given the size of that sector, that could have been much, much worse. So earlier intervention would have been better, but it certainly made a big difference. And the other thing we saw more generally was almost like a domino effect, that when we started to get these securements, these agreements with employers around sick pay, around people being taken off the work, but perhaps not losing pay for that, being able to work from home if they've got symptoms or they're required to self-isolate because they're in close contact with people, not giving them any detriment. Once that principle had been established, once we started to get that agreed across almost every sector, and some of these employers are on very tight margins, particularly public sector, companies like Serco, G4S, it's no great secret that these are companies with very, very tight and very fine margins here. And even they understood the potential risk for their business and the potential issues we'd have. So, it was surprising actually how quickly we were able to reach these agreements and how quickly almost entire sectors were able to reach the same standard and the same state of play. So again, my colleagues deserve huge credit for the speed at which they were able to turn these things around. Now, one of the biggest problems that we had, I mentioned it earlier on, was whether this was a public health issue or an occupational health issue. And the thing that surprised me, and still does stun me now to a degree, was the inability of HSE at this point, and we're really talking now from kind of early April all the way through to almost the end of May, to give us any real clear guidance and advice in this. And it wasn't they didn't have the ability, it was almost, to my mind, like they've been told, no, this is a public health issue, you've got your own issues to deal with. HSE clearly by this point weren't able to go out inspecting because they had similar issues around super spreader risk. So their field operations department effectively had been stood down and were working from home. We've got very good contacts because of our sectoral interest with a huge number of different inspectors and policy officers. They were telling us, yep, we can signpost you, we can talk to people in industry, we're happy to help, maybe develop sectoral things for industry, but what we can't do is put guidance out on our own because we're waiting to get clearance from Public Health England and from wider government. And I have to be frank, a lot of that early guidance for this, I mean, we didn't see stuff in the workplace until some time later, but the early guidance wasn't very good. It wasn't workplace specific. It was very much about, well, try and keep distance if you can. And most importantly, just cough into your elbow and wash your hands, which is fine for my 5-year-old daughter, but wasn't particularly great advice for people that were working at close quarters in factories, on production lines, particularly on building sites. And the particular issue we had here, both ourselves and Unite, was around building, was around construction, where we had that first set of very, very good guidance from the Construction Leadership Council, their standing operating procedures. And they were fantastic. So we then had a model and a basis to take into other sectors, but they didn't really pick up this point around transmission risk from close quarters working. And of course, on construction sites in particular, you've got big issues here because you've got different contractors working in very small areas at the same time who don't necessarily know each other, don't necessarily know their health condition, in some cases don't know if they've got symptoms. And you magnify that by the site, the scale of the site, the number of places these guys go in a working week, and the fact that we had suspicions even then about asymptomatic exposure, and it was obvious we had a problem because we were able to say to industry, look, we think we need FFP3 masks, and they were happy to say, yep, we don't disagree, but we can't find anywhere where the government are telling us that this is the position, and more to the point, we don't necessarily employ these guys directly. So we're not, having an argument with you, but we're not in a position to fund this for these guys. And that was a real problem. So we had this very good set of procedures, but we didn't have this singular approach that said, yes, here's a standard that you need. These workers are at higher risk because of the nature of what they do. So ultimately, we had to go back to Public Health England, and they were very clear. They didn't see this as an issue. They didn't see it as a risk. They felt there was no requirement for masks of any type, that social distancing was enough. Their view was that you can socially distance on a building site, no problem at all. And of course, the response from our members, the response from Unite members, almost across the board, was this is just unachievable. We can't maintain 2 meters social distancing when you're working effectively side by side or face to face with someone. And many of the tasks we have to do on a site involve that close quarters work. So there was never really any other option, apart from taking people out of the workplace altogether, than to say, look, you need to make provision for this. And in a huge number of sites across the UK, particularly the larger blue chip projects, that was able to be enacted very quickly. But I have to say it was in spite of the Public Health England guidance rather than because of it. And we've had this kind of continued issue about this, whether it is occupational or public health. And we still don't really, I think, personally have a resolution around that point. Now, I'm going to stop there very briefly, just to take a quick swig because I'm getting a bit dry. But what became very apparent was that this wasn't just a Public Health England position. It was easy enough to do the meetings and to sit there and talk to people from PHE and kind of explain to you blue in the face what the argument was. But actually, it was a much wider point from the government more generally. In the grand scheme of things, and no for anybody from HSE, obviously myself, Alan, Tony worked there previously, but compared to the size of Public Health England, HSE is quite a small agency. Compared to the Departments for Business, for Treasury, a very small fish. And it was obvious they weren't given primacy here. So we were in this position where the government were effectively telling us, you don't need to worry about this. This is a sort of small issue in the grand scheme of things. The hygiene is enough. The social distancing is enough. All of our members are either furloughed or the majority of them are still in work as key workers. As a result, we've got this real issue about workplace standards. It wasn't clear at all what should be happening, who should be enforcing the law, what law was being enforced. You know, we're making arguments about cost assessments, and employers are looking at this and saying, we don't understand what this means. We don't know about cost assessments. That's chemical stuff. We don't deal with chemicals. We couldn't get singular, clear advice from anybody. So in lots of cases, we went up developing it ourselves, and that came through trade associations. It came through partnership working in lots of different sectors, in the food sector, in construction, certainly in the waste industry. Lindsay, my counterpart, did a huge amount of work with the WISH Forum developing those standards. So we did see this point about misinformation. We saw it very much from the worker side on social media, but we had exactly the same problem with a lot of employers. There was an awful lot of misunderstanding about what this was and what the implications were. And again, I have to say, lucky enough, not the Prime Minister, but a certain President Trump didn't help matters when this became an issue for America, with some of the proclamations that were made over there. That drove an awful lot of bad practice and poor behaviour, because the view was, if the President of the United States is saying this, and I have to say again, particularly in companies that have got American arms or American counterparts, well, the American view is this, and therefore we don't think we need a different standard. And a lot of time was wasted that could have been spent productively working by having to have arguments about actually the nature and the scope of what the challenge and the risks were. So with hindsight, I'm hoping that won't happen this time around. I think everyone hopefully now is clear enough on exactly where we stand with this. But we did spend a lot of time arguing about things that really should not have been contentious. So we did eventually get some clarity. We did start to see clear policy in place. We started to see issues being resolved in terms of the hygiene standards that were needed, the importance of the deep cleaning, the importance critically of social distancing, and the more general point about small teams and cohorting. But then we had a secondary problem about enforcement, because the feedback we got very strongly, and I'll cite these two cases, was that some employers were simply not complying. They were playing fast and loose with the law. There were certain sectors that were worse than others. Food manufacturing was a particular problem, and logistics and warehousing was a particular problem. So in these two cases, in Knowsley, up in the northwest, in the Massland Distribution Centre, there was literally no social distancing. There was very little PPE. And what we saw as a result was a real issue in terms of trying to get action on this. We raised it with HSE. HSE at this point didn't have the capacity to send anybody out to inspect. We then raised it with the Police and Crime Commissioner on the view that perhaps these regulations that have been brought in by the government would allow the police to intervene. Ultimately, what changed the position there was a threat of a strike action and a walkout threat. And that effectively turned around to the employer and said, look, you've got two choices. Either you resolve this or there'll be nobody here to do this for you. And clearly the retail sector at that point were extremely busy as demand grew and grew. So that gave us a great sort of opportunity and great impetus, actually. And most importantly, from a union point of view, there was a collective spirit there amongst the workers. It's very often difficult to mobilise people to do things because you don't have that single collective view. Here with this, it was obvious that the risk was very high. And as a result, there was no problem at all in mobilising people to take action. So we did have control there. We did have that power there. It was really a question of how far we could exercise it. And the counterpoint to that actually is the other photo. That's Bakkavor, who are a large producer of manufactured processed microwave meals, ready meals and other foods. This particular site in London was primarily a BAME workforce, mostly Bangladesh, I think. And as a result, there were some big issues there about what you might call a command and control culture. The issue we had here specifically, again, was a lack of social distancing, but also a failure to provide adequate PPE. At this stage, we didn't have the regulations in around face coverings, but the company, rather than giving people masks, was simply giving them either snoods or very, very weak, very temporary kind of face, almost paper coverings, and saying this is sufficient for what you need. Now, these workers are working at very close quarters. There's a general problem about understanding of controls. Some of that is cultural, some of that's linguistic, but the response very much was, we need people to come into work. We need people to come in. We are so busy getting product out now because the demand is so high that we can't let standards go. We have to have this almost running 24/7. So again, we were able to get footage to both The Guardian, the ITN News and the HSE around this. And that was the end of March and early April. And this is still being investigated. We're still waiting to hear whether there'll be formal action taken. But in this respect, we couldn't do very much more than that because we didn't have that opportunity. The workers were never, ever going to say, right, we will exercise our right to walk out. So these two real case studies show you the spectrum of how things work and how that power directive is actually critical for me. The one thing I would say more than anything that was very clear cut at this stage was the importance, I'm not just saying this because I'm on an IOSH webinar, of having really competent people managing health and safety. Where you've got professionals, where you have people that had a background in health and safety, that understood what the issues were, we really had much better outcomes in terms of joint working, in understanding the severity of the issues, understanding what needed to be done, having a clear view of what a risk assessment constituted for COVID, even before the government's guidance, and having a process in place to work through that. So the best outcomes we had, those larger businesses, in some cases smaller businesses, that had the time, had the effort, and had the people that could say, right, we need to go through these steps. There is a list of things we can do. We do need to get measures put into place, and we need to do them quickly. I mean, again, bear in mind here that we're not talking about industries that had time, resources, and almost unlimited budgets to put things into place. This was all going on while this key work was being done. So these were either security companies, they were public sector bodies, in many cases they were retailers, they were manufacturers who were working at really high volume because of the wider demand caused by lockdown. So the pressure was absolutely enormous. And to a degree that did focus, I think, everyone's mind. And then there was this fear to a point of wildcat strikes, people walking out. But from our end, that's the last thing we wanted. We wanted to ensure that people were staying in work, but staying in work safely. And what made a huge difference there was having people that understood what control measures looked like, what could be achieved, how quickly it could be achieved, and having the contacts in place to be able to say, right, our risk assessment's been agreed with the union side, with the workers. These are the actions we need to take jointly. These are the things that we need to do to get measures in place quickly to ensure that we're managing this risk. And actually where we saw that, we saw production almost being unaffected, and those rates of infection in those companies was very low. So I couldn't stress enough how important it was dealing with people that were competent and knew how to address the situation. It really was night and day, both for myself and for my colleagues regionally, in terms of the approach that employers were taking. Now, this is a very busy slide, and I apologise for that. I wouldn't expect you to read it all here on the screen, but I'm fairly sure it will be circulated afterwards. But this almost actually was the crux of the matter in terms of this point about law, because we were contacted by the Department for Business at the end of April around a whole range of different sectoral issues in terms of return to work process. And that was a bit of a shock. We thought it would be HSE that were leading on workplace health and safety issues. If not them, then probably Public Health England will be the lead regulator. But the call came from the Department for Business, and it was to have a discussion around what a safe return to work might look like. Lockdown was clearly about to be phased out. What steps would be needed to be taken? How could it be managed in terms of giving people a framework for a safe return to work? Fine, not a problem. I spent all of a weekend talking to colleagues internally about the different sectors that were involved, getting feedback from them on what we thought the key issues were. Colleagues at the Trade Union Congress, other trade unions did the same thing. We spoke to colleagues from other trade associations, again, through the tripartite groups through HSE. So that then kind of evolved into these series of more formal discussions, many of which had either the Minister or Secretary of State on, in terms of how this could be developed into formal guidance and a strong approach that was backed by law. The problem that we had with it actually was very clear cut from the start. It was obvious that the people we were talking to on the civil service side weren't practitioners, they weren't civil servants, had a great understanding of health and safety law. They weren't HSE people, they weren't inspectors, they weren't public health experts. So they were purely doing this from a point of what can we do to make sure there are standards, but they're not going to cause huge burdens for business. And that gave a strong sense that actually this was a bit of a fait accompli. This was all an exercise in ticking boxes, ensuring it was seen to be consulted upon, but actually the approach had been almost set behind the scenes beforehand. And what really gave strength to that view was the first weekend in May, when we were told, literally with no notice, that there'd be a consultation process for these guides. There'd be 7 sectoral guides, and we'd be launching something as a government to allow you to feedback and comment on these guides. So we had no prior sight on these. There had been general discussions about principles. We were told on Sunday morning, you've got 12 hours to complete these set of responses on this web portal. And some of you may have been involved in that process. It was a very long, very draining day. because effectively you had 7 versions of exactly the same thing with some minor nuances and tweaks depending on the different sector. But it made responding very difficult. It was, because of the web nature of the portal, you couldn't put in like a free text response. It was almost replying by kind of text message or Twitter. And that was quite frustrating and did seem quite clearly designed to be limiting what we could say and how we could say it. But what really shocked me was the omission that was there. There was nothing at all in there in terms of what face masks need to be worn, what standard needs to be for PPE. There was nothing about the risk to vulnerable workers and how that should be managed. Most crucially, the first version of that, although it was subsequently dealt with, didn't really talk about risk assessment. It just talked about general practical steps that need to be taken. So we had real concerns about the quality of what was being put out. At this point, it wasn't clear what the kind of overall approach would be, but simply that the Department for Business needed to get something out about this issue on workplaces because of these issues that I sort of referenced previously. Boris Johnson then gave a speech in the House of Commons. During that, he talked about COVID secure workplaces, a phrase none of us had heard before, and the suite of safer workplaces guidance that was about to be published. And yeah, within hours of that speech, Bayes very late in the day on the 11th of May published the first draft of the safer workplaces guidance, and we've had this approach ever since. And that has muddied the waters to a large degree because it's created this idea of COVID security, which isn't really something that, to my mind, exists in health and safety law, and is very difficult to actually enforce in practice because any worker at any time can be carrying COVID into the workplace with no symptoms whatsoever, having picked it up at home or through the community. So for me, and I think for many of our trade union colleagues, this idea of COVID security is something of a misnomer because no real workplace, nowhere really can be secure from COVID in a pandemic. Although I'm sure some of you will be working in very high level sort of biological places that do have very better protections in. So there was huge frustration, I think, with the government that continues again to this day in the way this was handled. And it really contrasts, I have to say, with other devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, and to a lesser degree Northern Ireland. We had very good dialogue. It was very open, very much two-way dialogue in terms of what needed to be done and the way things could be developed. Scotland and Wales in particular are very tripartite, even though Scotland has an SNP government that has not always been trade union friendly. With the UK government, with Bayes, this was very much about them, in my view, having a certain approach and a certain view on this and almost going to rubber stamp that approach. And again, it's no secret we've had big issues with that almost from day one of publication. So it has created real uncertainty out there. Mixed messages has been a theme through this entire pandemic, and I've termed it the problem of COVID security. It's not entirely clear what many employers, particularly smaller employers, should do. There's a general understanding of the Health and Safety at Work Act and what that means, but there's not great clarity on what the actual practical steps are. So many are following this COVID secure guidance, but finding that's only really a framework with principles, and it doesn't really give them enough detail. So it is causing problems, and in many respects, what we're doing as much as anything is signposting people to sectoral agreements, sectoral guidance that's been produced independently of government to be able to say, okay, for your sector, here are some concrete standards and here are some actions that are needed. And we drive that from our end then and trying to reinforce that through the checklist, through the materials that we develop for our union reps from the health and safety side. It's caused great issues in terms of COSH and COSH assessments because it's not clear now whether those are needed, whether the COVID secure guidance supersedes them. There's not really any discussion of COSH in that COVID secure safer workplace suite. It's quite deliberately designed to go away from that as an approach. And that's created issues. It's created real problems in terms of PPE provision. Because in some sectors, again, in care, in the NHS and ambulances, we've got very good, very clear standards of PPE. For other members in retail, in security, in schools, in construction, that are still coming into very close contact with other workers, with the public, with pupils, we've at best got some general advice around face coverings. That has its own issues, and I'll come on in a minute as to why it's a real problem, particularly in schools. But it's muddied the waters. Because probably 6 months ago, with something like this, you'd have had a very clear approach of COSH, of PPE being that last chain, really, in that hierarchy. Now it's very much a, well, you may want face coverings. It's a pandemic. To a degree, what can we do? The problem it caused for us, more than anything, was this point around Section 44 of the Employment Rights Act. And this is the one that says, fundamentally, if your job is very dangerous, you can walk away from the job with no detriment. We've had real issues with this. Again, another social media meme that's developed. You know, you see it very often, particularly on Facebook. You know, if your job is unsafe, you can walk away from it with no detriment. Unfortunately, the reality is very different, and we don't encourage members to do this unless it really is the absolute last resort and they have strong evidence to justify the action. Because the experience of members is very much been one of two things. If you can take the workforce with you, i.e. everybody has to walk away, then generally everyone will have a degree of protection from the strength in numbers. If it's a small group or individual worker and they try and invoke this, they almost certainly will end up being made redundant. They'll be sacked. As a result, they probably won't be able to claim universal credits. And yes, you can take an employer to tribunal, but obviously at the moment, the courts are either suspended or overwhelmed. So this is not something that will resolve itself anytime soon. So for us, it was always very much the nuclear option, but it suddenly became something that had great popularity more generally among the labour movement and among some other trade unions. The only time it was really invoked specifically in GMB, apart from that issue in Knowsley, was in Scotland, where there were big issues in waste collection, where some councils weren't really controlling the risk to the public, and really more actually the risk to our members of the public coming very close. There were real issues about the public coming up being very aggressive when the rubbish bins weren't collected on a weekly basis. And in some respects, we had to suspend operations because people being spat at, being physically abused, being very aggressively treated and talked to. And obviously that COVID risk, if you're being spat at, is extremely high. But those are really the only circumstances where we had to try and invoke that. Unfortunately, it's become, again, this common currency almost that exists as a basic protection. And it has to be really taken in context. And ultimately, the last point to a degree still stands. If there isn't this joint working, if you can't agree controls together, then the point was how do we escalate this? Where do we take it? What goes on? We've got some clarity now in terms of HSE being able to take calls and farm things out as need be. But again, that's quite a reductive process that takes some time. We'd like to have had much clearer guidance that could have been easily implemented on a sectoral level than having to resolve everything ultimately through either the regulator, whether it's the local environment officer or an HSE inspector. So that was a real problem and continues to be in some respects. So where are we ending up now? What's the kind of ultimate state of play with this? Well, these mixed messages haven't really gone away. From our view, and this is something we'll be pushing very hard probably over the next few weeks as things continue to develop and probably get worse. Employers have had now 6 months to get their heads around what needs to be done. A lot of the initial decision making was understandable because it was novel and in light of the information that was at hand. We're now quite a way into this pandemic and we have a much better idea, not only of what the issues are, but of what the measures that need to be taken as a result. So our line very much will be, well, we have to get it right, not just employers, but ourselves, everyone now. There are no excuses for this. We know what needs to be done. It's a question of making sure we've got the provision in place. So the big issues that we're seeing are particularly at the moment around aerosol transmission and how you risk assess that risk, that hazard. Because it's one thing, as the PHE statement says that's just been released, to say there is a risk here of transmission from aerosols and therefore ventilate your workplace. But the experience of our members, again, in care, in prisons, in schools, is that you don't always have functional ventilation. You don't always have air conditioning. It's not always possible, particularly in prisons, care homes, to open a window up to ventilate. And there's very little been said about what we do in those circumstances. The obvious thing is to go back and say, right, you go through that hierarchy, you give PPE, we want face masks. But in practice, that's very difficult. In care homes, it's already there to a degree, but in prisons, it's much harder. In schools, it becomes a huge political issue. So we're looking for a resolution around that. Schools are further compromised by this potential risk of children transmission. And again, I hate to say it, but it's been mixed messages. Just earlier this week, on the one hand, we had the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, say that the highest rate of infection was coming from the ages of 10 to 19-year-olds. But even within that bracket, it was 16 years upwards. That was then directly contradicted by the release of the SAGE minutes this week that said the single biggest measure that could be taken that the government could do to reduce the risk, to get the R number back below 1, will be to close all schools. So it clearly can't be the case that on the one hand, the risk is 16 years and upwards, being driven by university students and sixth formers, but at the same time, the biggest control measure is closing schools that are mostly populated by children under the age of 16. Something doesn't add up there. We're not clear yet from an evidential point of view whether children are spreading this disease, this virus, but certainly from an experience of the members' point of view, anecdotally, there's no doubt that schools are starting to have to take really hard decisions about taking bubbles out of schools, about colleagues self-isolating, because the numbers are happening so quickly. We also need to see much better, clearer advice around the protection of groups that we know are at risk. So particularly BAME workers, disabled workers, older workers, and those that have been shielding. There's been very little out there in terms of what needs to be done. We know these groups are at higher risk. We know particularly that shielding workers obviously were at very high risk because they had to shield, but that shielding status hasn't been re-implemented. We called for it as part of the most recent package of measures. We were not successful in that. The government has said that they may look at it again in very specific circumstances where those numbers keep going up. But frankly, if you look at Liverpool at the moment, if that's not enough of an argument to reinstate shielding, it's difficult to know what will be. So there are workers that are still have to go to work, that don't necessarily have the protection we think they need, that are known to have these very high and very severe, in some cases, medical conditions, that are being told you have to come into the workplace because you can't work from home. And we think they're being put at very high risk. We also think that BAME workers and disabled workers have been very badly served by both the government and PHE, because we've seen research from the summer that identified that these groups were at higher risk. I think 6 in 10 of every death from COVID in the UK has been to someone with a disability of some sort. There's been very little explaining why that should be and what measures have to be taken by employers. And it's very difficult for us as a union to argue for anything except home working if you're not clear on what those measures should be. So we are extremely disappointed that hasn't really been tackled or addressed in any meaningful way, because again, the time was there over the summer to do that, or at least to commission that work and be public about that. The other 3 things I think that are more generally longer term from this is the obvious point about the mental health impact, not just of the lockdown itself and the restrictions that everyone's had on their life and their liberty because of the lockdown, but also the wider, what I call existential risk from COVID. So I'm now in my mid-40s. I grew up with probably the twin fears lurking in the background of nuclear war and AIDS. For this generation, it will be very much, I think, around COVID. I think there's a lot we can learn from the experience of 100 years ago with Spanish flu, but even then, there will have to be investment from government, significant investment after this, in terms of both child and adult mental health services, because we really will see an explosion, both of people fearing for their jobs and fearing more widely about their own sort of mental health. A recent survey we did of over 12,000 members suggested that 2 in 3 said they were suffering with their mental health as a result of the COVID situation. And we think that was a significant underplaying of that risk. So I can almost certainly say that we will get through this. At some point, things will return to normal from a health point of view in terms of COVID risk, but the mental health explosion will be the next pandemic. The 2 things I think that I would say in terms of conclusion that would help to resolve this would be almost going back where I started in terms of getting much clearer information and reporting about what's happening in workplaces. We've been very disappointed that riddle reporting hasn't been used as a tool in any way, shape or form to tackle these issues. And outside of that, the more general point around integrating COVID into general risk management. For the first few probably weeks of this pandemic, this was very much seen as something that was novel because it was new. We're now at a point more than 6 months in where people need to be thinking about managing this in the longer term. I'm very hopeful we'll see a working and hopefully very powerful vaccine for COVID, but that will take some time. Getting it to scale, getting it out to the whole population will take considerable time. So I think we're looking at another year to 18 months at least of trying to live with and manage COVID. And as a result, we need to be thinking now about how this integrates into everyday risk management. It isn't just a novel thing that disappears. We do have to be looking at managing this for a longer period. And the thing that may stem from that, to be frank, is this point about long COVID, which is very much emergent. We don't have a position on it yet, but we are starting to see members that are developing symptoms some months after they originally diagnosed with COVID. And that creates a whole range of difficulties about whether they're fit to work, what they can do, whether they need to be having adjustments made for them, whether they're disabled workers for a temporary period or not. All of these things are starting to emerge from this. So the first period may be over, but there are new things coming up. And certainly from my point of view, that workload really hasn't changed from the end of February, early March to where we are now. Just some final points and then have to take some questions. I mentioned a couple of things during the wider presentation. I'd certainly recommend looking at our coronavirus hub. Anyone's welcome to look at that through the web link, and a lot of the materials will be refreshed and changing over the next week or two because of this recognition now that we are looking at a second wave and things are slightly different. One of the things that we are keen to make use of, it's not by any means a scientific piece of work, but we developed what we're calling a pre-assessment risk indicator for our BAME members. That's been taken from a combination of PHE reports, ONS reports, wider studies that have been done about the risk, particularly to BAME workers, and also reflecting the experience of our own BAME members in terms of what's happened to them in their workplaces and their families. So it isn't the most scientifically robust piece of work in the world. It's not designed for employers to risk assess. It's designed for our members to do their own assessment of their circumstances, and then they can take to their employer and say, look, from the basis of what I'm seeing here, I probably am at a higher risk, and I'd like you to look at me and consider me in that light rather than sort of being neutral like everybody else. I certainly recommend looking at the TUC's COVID guidance as well. Again, many of the unions are doing similar sorts of work, but we've tried to take a lead in terms of COVID because as much as anything, we've got the experience and resource from the different sectors. And finally, if anybody has any further queries, any comments, Alan's got my number. The Twitter details are up there. But to be frank, the easiest way to get hold of me at the moment more than anything is through the email because most of my working day is spent doing meetings like this. But if anybody does have any comments, anything that comes to mind, then I'm very happy to deal with that. Things are very busy at the moment. Always happy to pick up emails when they are. But with that, Alan, happy to take any questions. And again, thank you very much for taking the time to listen. I hope it wasn't too dull.
No.